Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, distinguished guests, we'll begin in the usual way by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and by paying our respects to their elders, past and present. My name is Brendan Taylor and I'm the head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU, and it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to this evening's 2024 Robert O'Neill War Studies Lecture. It's really with a mixture of joy and a good deal of sadness that I introduce this evening's lecture. It's a very happy moment, as it's the first time in a number of years that we've been able to hold this relatively long-standing annual lecture, which was forced into a temporary hiatus by the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's also the first in the series where we don't have Bob O'Neill here in attendance with us. I'd like to extend our condolences once again to Bob's wife, Sally, and to Bob's nephew, Mark, and our thanks to them both for making the journey here to be with us this evening, and Sally not only for that but also for sharing Bob with us so generously with us for a great many years. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that without Sally, SDSC may well not exist. And while I know that you're very eager to hear from tonight's lecturer, Professor Craig Stockings, I hope you might permit me just a few moments to share a quote from a short extract from a chapter that Bob wrote reflecting on his career. This is what Bob wrote. He said, "When Hedley Bull, the then head of the Department of International Relations in which I served, ran the question of my succeeding Tom Miller by me in early 1970, I replied in the negative. 24 hours later, after a good deal of soul searching and a discussion with my wife Sally, I advised Bull that I would be willing to take on the SDSC headship. It would have been too selfish for me to have stuck with my initial preference, I thought, and the foundations of a serious analytical capacity in the field of international security at ANU would have been weakened had I not been willing to take the burden of running SDSC off Miller's shoulders. Thus, the die encasing my academic career was cast, and not a bad cast it was, leading me on to 20 years of international service in positions of this kind after 11 and a half years as head of SDSC. I think that quote tells us a lot about the sort of person that Bob was and his generosity, but I think it also reminds us just how lucky we were that he asked Sally and that Sally did give him that advice. So it's really wonderful having you here this evening, so thank you again, Sally. I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with Bob's extraordinary career following his time here at the SDSC, which saw him go on to direct the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London before his appointment to the prestigious Chichele Professor of the History of War at Oxford. Following his retirement from that post in 2001, he went on to play a pivotal role in the establishment of Australia's leading foreign and defence policy think tanks, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, and it's wonderful to see its inaugural director, Hugh White, here, who we managed to steal a few years later here this evening, but also the Lowy Institute for, and I think we owe you the credit for that, Paul, for bringing Hugh to us, but also the Lowy Institute for International Policy and also the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. I think it is really no exaggeration to say that no other Australian has made a more substantial contribution to the field of strategic and defence studies than Professor Robert O'Neill. I'm certain that Bob, being an official historian himself of Australia's role in the Korean War, would be absolutely delighted that Professor Craig Stockings will deliver the 2024 iteration of the lecture named in his honour. Craig, of course, is a very distinguished military historian in his own right. He is currently Professor of History and Head of the School of Humanity and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. And of particular relevance to this evening's lecture, he is concurrently appointed as the official historian of Australian operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Australian Peacekeeping Operations in East Timor. He is the general editor of all 6 volumes in that series and authored the first, which has received rave reviews, entitled Born of Fire and Ash, Australian Operations in Response to the East Timor Crisis 1999 to 2000. Craig, many thanks for doing us the honour of delivering the 2024 Robert O'Neill War Studies Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, distinguished guests, please join me in welcoming Professor Craig Stockings to the podium.
Well, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, it is not only my honour, but it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all this evening for such an august lecture. Thank you again, Brendan. As Brendan alluded to, and as you are well aware, Bob O'Neill was an Australian historian and academic of the highest stature. As Brendan indicated, he served not only as head of Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, but in IISS and the professorship, or the Chichele Professorship of the History of War at Oxford. Bob was this nation's third official historian, and that's a distinction I want to return to momentarily. More poignantly for me, ladies and gentlemen, Bob was a friend and something of a comrade in arms. Indeed, Bob and I, separated by a generation, had much in common in our professional lives. He graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1958, 38 years before I did the same. He went on to serve as an infantry officer with operational service as a young captain in Vietnam in 1966 and 1967. I also saw my first and only operational deployment as a two-young captain in East Timor in 1999. We both left uniform shortly thereafter in that stages of our professional career and transitioned into the realm of academia. I can only hope the pattern continues. A stint at Oxford would be really nice, thank you very much. But of more relevance, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that both Bob and I served and do serve as Australian official historians. He, as Brendan noted, of a two-volume series, Australia in the Korean War, 1950 to 53, and myself, a series rather clumsily entitled, they did a great job, Brendan, Australian Operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Australian Peacekeeping Operations in East Timor. Bob was appointed to this position by the government in 1970, and his works were published between 1981 and 1985, a period of 15 years from start to finish. My appointment began in 2016 and is ongoing, with one of the 6 volumes currently published, my own, a second undergoing a clearance procedure by relevant government agencies and departments, 2 more ready to enter that clearance procedure, and the last 2 which will be finished in the drafting stage this calendar year. I've got until 2031 to match Bob's speed. I think he might beat me in that regard, and he wrote 2 volumes, I penned only the 1. During Bob's appointment as official historian, the government maintained this tradition, unique tradition, of granting him independence in his work, though it is understood the Attorney General's Department did attempt to influence Bob's treatment of the alleged traitor and journalist Wilfred Burford. This type of challenge is a theme I'll elaborate on a little later. Indeed, the very last communication I had with Bob was a very kind letter he sent me offering me his personal support during a difficult period prior to the publication of my own volume, Born of Fire and Ash. He noted at that point, and I remember reading it, that nothing that is important is easy. And he encouraged me to stay the course. I was grateful at the time, and I remain so to this day. I'm grateful also for his signing of a letter along with the other living official historians, Professor David Horner and Peter Edwards, to the Secretary of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in November of 2019, again in support of the series and in an attempt to help overcome some of the challenges that we faced and do face still. I note as an aside that in contrast the official histories of World War I and World War II, Bob also pioneered the use of footnotes and things like bibliographies to identify his sources, a tradition carried forward to this day in the genre. But importantly, there is no question that his Australia in the Korean War is a masterful work. As I mentioned, Volume 1, published in 1981, the same year Trevor Chappell bowled underarm and Peter Carey won the Miles Franklin. Volume 2 in 1985, when New South Wales won the first State of Origin and Nintendo debuted an Italian plumber called Mario. It's a lifetime ago. Both were well received by the critics. Indeed, the only criticism I ever heard would be from a few pundits was that Bob's work was quite detailed, as if painstaking and thorough research ought to be considered anything short of commendable. The late Professor Geoffrey Gray called his works essential readings, while Professor Edwards, whom I've mentioned, Bob's successor, in his own series on Southeast Asian conflicts 1948 to 75, praised his detailed and authoritative coverage. To some considerable degree then, it is in Bob's footsteps that I tread, and to continue the analogy, it's shoes I don't want to fill. It is, however, in the vein of official histories that I want to talk with you tonight. In the short time we have available, and fearful of the truism that academics love the sound of their own voices, I'll be sure to try and finish with enough time for any questions at the end. But in particular, I want to spend a bit of time talking to you about my own volume of my own official history series. My thanks to Brendan once more for the invitation, to SDSC, and to all of you for the opportunity to share some of those trials and tribulations, and perhaps get your thoughts towards the end. Well, I think an appropriate point to start, for some of you a bit less familiar with the genre, might be to describe what official history really means, and why it's different from the works we produce, is different from those that come before it on similar topics, and will be different to those that follow. For the writing of official history in Australia has more than a century-old tradition. It's an institution tied intimately to the War Memorial, which has sponsored such work from its inception, yet the projects themselves have always been commissioned by government. Well, what does that really mean? Well, it means they are histories for and of all Australians. They're detailed chronological records of services in theatres and conflict, and can constitute, in my point of view, but I would say this, an invaluable resource for readers of all levels, from the scholars to the general public. And they're national assets, comprehensive, authoritative, independent and accessible accounts of Australia's experience in war. Now, the second last point is the one worth dwelling upon here, for unlike similar projects anywhere else across the Anglosphere, Australia's official history tradition is unique in that these works are produced outside the system, as it were. That is, no public service department or agency controls the research or production of Australian official history volumes. No one may direct the contents of these volumes or unduly attempt to influence the official historian. In theory anyways, again more on that a little later. In this sense though, official histories are official only in as much as they are commissioned by the government and as a national record of Australia's involvement in these particular conflicts. I have access to the closed period of the classified government records, yet those volumes contain my own interpretations and judgments and do not follow an official or government line. They are a record of government actions based on official sources, but they are not government stories, and they can never be government stories, or means by which certain narratives might be perpetuated at the expense of certain others. So official histories then are the product of historical investigation by independent researchers. Government pays the bill, doesn't get to decide what's written. But they're also a foundation for future historians too, and an accessible way for the public, and importantly the veteran community, to gain some insight to the operations and theatres under examination. I think this is particularly important today, given what I describe as something of a disconnect between this country's 21st century's warfare and the wider wars it's been involved in, and the wider Australian public. There is a disconnect there. I think it's important too, given what I might describe as something of a mismatch between the public narrative of events in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan, and the historical evidence at hand. Our outlook's straightforward. We've not self-censored. We've included the bad with the good, because frictions and mistakes are as valid a part of the historical record as are unbridled successes. Indeed, achievements in spite of institutional shortcomings, to my mind, tend to enhance the legacy of those involved, not the reverse. We've written as we've seen it, and where the evidence trail is indicated. These volumes therefore aim to be truthful, not necessarily triumphal. As I alluded, Australian government has thus far commissioned 4 separate official history series in addition to Bob's and my own. No doubt you're all aware of the inaugural official history of Australia in the War of 1914-18, edited of course by the first official historian, Charles Bean. Following being the official history of Australia's involvement in the Second World War represents one of the longest and largest historical projects the nation has ever seen, running from 1943 to 1977. Again, as I've alluded to, after Bob's Korean War work came Peter Edwards' Southeast Asian Conflict series, and in 2004 Professor David Horn over here was commissioned to write the 5th series relating to peacekeeping and post-Cold War operations. My own series then is just a continuance of this tradition. Again, I would say this, but the national significance of this genre speaks for itself. Australian involvement in the Middle East in the 21st century is complex and it's long running. Well over 40,000 Australian Defence Force personnel and public service personnel served or supported these deployments over 13 years. Sadly, 44 Australians lost their lives on active service in these theatres, and hundreds more were wounded physically and psychologically too. The social and military effect of these conflicts globally and within our nation is profound. By the same token, Australia's involvement in East Timor in 1999 and 2000 was our largest ever mission conducted under United Nations auspices, the largest overseas deployment since the Vietnam War, and by some measures larger still. An instrumental part of Timor-Leste gaining its independence. Subsequent United Nations and ADF deployments to 2012 gave vital support to that fledgling nation. Taken in total, these operations constitute an important part of this nation's recent past, and one that clearly needs not just to be chronicled, but to be analysed. There is no question that each of the 5 official histories that have preceded my own have faced their own specific challenges and enjoyed their own individual advantages. I briefly have already noted Bob's difficulties with the Attorney General's Department. One key difference between this series and those that have gone before it, though, is the type and level of governance imposed upon and within the project. For in stark reversal of the situation of David's peacekeeping series, I've been more than well funded for the task at hand. The team has enjoyed a level of material resourcing not available to any official historian of years past. But the obverse of deep government and memorial investment in the project is extremely tight timeframes and reasonably rigid government frameworks. My author teams initially had 5 years to complete their volumes, extended to 6.5 in 2018. I'll explain why later. This is a great deal less than has been available for any official history project to that date. Importantly, as with my recent predecessors, my commission provided for controlled access to government files and records authorised under special access conditions of the Archives Act, subject only to national security requirements and restrictions. Though these volumes are themselves unclassified and written with that outcome in mind, they are based on a thorough study of the highly classified record made available by government for the operations covered by me. Material excluded from myself, from my team and from publication in whole or part is only that judged by relevant agencies to be potentially damaging to Australian national interests or national security. And those agencies that have chosen to restrict their cooperation, and there have been some, and access, have done so on these grounds. I stand before you and say I do not believe that such omissions that have occurred have altered the conclusions reached in these volumes in any fundamental manner. In terms of my own volume, I am not too proud to admit it was a difficult undertaking. Difficult in truth on 3 levels. In practical terms, on a psychological level and an emotional level too. First was the challenge of accessing records, particularly electronic records from government departments and agencies. For it was quickly apparent to me that the bureaucracy looked on events in Timor and Iraq and Afghanistan with a whole new level of concern, reputational concern and sensitivity than had regards the perceived benign nature of the official history series that preceded us. The relatively free hand given to the peacekeepers to sift through Defence's electronic repositories, for example, was never going to be replicated for me. Not that I knew it at the time. Far more appeared to be at stake for various parties. With procedural and with structural barriers in place, the flow of records became unacceptably slow. And events came to a head in 2017. The net result was an 18-month extension and a raising of an entirely new directorate within the Department of Defence whose sole job was to catch and pass records to the project at an acceptable rate. In the end, flow rates were attained, but the personal and the mental toll was heavy. At all points, there were few who were aware of the intricacies, the structures, the forces, and the personalities against and within which the project struggled. As records began to flow, though, into the project at a rapid rate, another important difficulty emerged. That is one that you might call more methodological. That is the practical challenge that might be described also as the risk of dying or drowning in a sea of infinite data. All records created by the Department of Defence and the rest of the bureaucracy in Canberra in any way related to events in the 3 theatres under investigation exists in electronic formats. Just think of this: all the emails, all the PowerPoint presentations, all the Word docs, the WhatsApp chat groups, the spreadsheets, any other form of data presentation conceivable. And the drafts of all those documents, complete with track changes in many cases. Not only do they all exist, all are considered official records. While certainly a lot of this data is not easily accessed or curated in a form that makes it easy to use, the point here is the amount of material open for historical purposes may as well be infinite. What then is a researcher to do? There is simply insufficient time and resources to examine even a fraction of this record. The more typical trawl approach to research, where a scholar might try to collect a large proportion of the available record for interrogation, is not possible in 21st century official history or any research. Robust or rather normative approaches have had to change to be modified towards more targeted outcomes. Sets of filters need to be built. To a far greater extent than anything in my own previous experience, we seek specific answers to specific questions. Accept that gaps will emerge as we progress and try to fill them as they emerge. This is a challenging workplace adjustment for most of us, and most in the team. No less a challenge, the psychological ramifications of infinite data. For myself, for most of the team, for example, previous empirical research projects have always involved working through a finite amount of material or archival stacks. I felt and I feel duly conscientious when I can put hand on heart and tell myself I viewed whole, or at least a goodly part of the relevant record. I write history then from what I've seen. In truth, this sense of security has always been a falsehood. Intellectually, I'm aware that the record that has entered various archives only ever represented less than a fraction of a percent of that produced at the time. It's long ago been collected, destroyed, culled and curated. I've only ever written history from the smallest sliver of data that's available to me, yet I find solace in the fact that what lies outside of that record no longer exists and I can't access it. Now the game's changed. So the Timor crisis of 1999 occurred at a point of transition where most departments, not all, were moving from a paper to an electronic record keeping system. And I did benefit somewhat from a partially curated archive. But for the other 5 volumes, I've certainly got a sense of the digital sprawl that has since become the norm. Digital files filled with diamonds, surrounded by electronic clutter. Some of it in file formats long obsolete. But the question is, where to stop? Where is my solace now, or comfort? To this, all I can say is mindsets have and have had to alter. We have deadlines. We have fiscal constraint. We need to stop when reasonable answers have been garnered to the research questions at hand. We need to be comfortable with what has not been done. This has not been an easy or comfortable transition either. It is, however, in my mind, the future of empirical research in the digital age from now on. Another difficulty, I do admit to you, was the subject matter at hand. The background reading is disturbing, to say the least. As many of you may know, from the time of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, either directly or as a consequence of the policies of occupation, as many as 200,000 people lost their lives. According to some estimate, this is a higher proportion of death was in such a small community than any other 20th century experience. It's a traumatic story. So too in early September 99, the surge of violence that broke out in East Timor chased more than a quarter of the 800,000 inhabitants from their homes and killed many, often in gruesome fashions. This was the price the Timorese paid for their self-determination. This was why there was an Australian response. A special note here from me to the bravery of journalists who kept the flow of information and disturbing images coming out of the province during this period at great personal risk. For scenes of destruction and violence shocked people across Australia from the cabinet room to the street. Imagine a protest in Melbourne of 40,000 people demanding a military intervention. Scenes of destruction and violence shocked people across the nation. Researching the atrocities perpetuated by anti-independence militias of the period under the guidance, direction and with direct support from the Indonesian military was a deeply troubling experience. Yeah, it's history, it's certainly not pleasant. Let me now address something of the elephant of the room, which I've been sort of towing around. Despite the challenges I've listed, perhaps the most difficult, traumatic, frustrating, mentally and emotionally draining aspect of producing a volume had nothing to do with research or writing it. Rather, the bureaucratic process of clearing this book was its greatest challenge. Conciliation to have the volume approved for publication. This issue has continued in the second East Timor volume, now under the clearance process for more than 2 years. The agreed time frames are 6 months. Of course, due to the nature of the sources used in preparation, it is entirely right that these volumes have a clearance process. And for entirely appropriate reasons then, they need to be checked to make sure there's no inappropriate information released into the public domain. But for my volume, that part of the process was quick and frictionless. It resulted in minimal changes, and certainly none that came close to compromising the integrity of the volume itself. The air of ambiguity, though, is what might be understood as something of a blurred line between reasonable information security and institutional discomfort at various levels within the bureaucracy. This discomfort is about content, not classification. A very large part of those 3 years of struggle, for example, were about how much contextual material or background material such a volume ought to contain. My view was there needed to be such an amount of such material such that a public reader could make sense of the events of 1999. This included, for instance, a long-term survey of Australia's policy position with regards to the issue of East Timor's independence. This was not a view shared by all stakeholders. Indeed, it was vigorously contested by some. I still remember one particularly high-level meeting with a very senior departmental bureaucrat who congratulated me on a great book, much handshaking and backslapping. Then asked for the first 9 chapters to be removed, of 27. Removed on the grounds that the book should begin when the first Australian boot actually trod on East Timorese soil. A great way to avoid some uncomfortable policy truth, perhaps, no way to write history. From here, the back and forth began with agreements reached only to have different sets of judges raise new objections. Even once the book was published, there remained echoes of arguments long done. Arguments being re-prosecuted, I should say. The Warm World did not have a book launch, a remarkable and unprecedented decision, though I admit did hold an event to mark the existence of the book sometime later. I worry about this bureaucratic hesitance, reputational or risk avoidance. I feel like it extends well beyond the official histories. More broadly, now that we're done, I'm sometimes asked what are the main themes or threads that emerge from writing of this volume. There are many. Let me share just 2. One from a veteran's perspective and one from a policy perspective. If I were to point to one common refrain from most veterans that we interviewed, and we've interviewed just shy of 3,000, it would be a certain duality of feelings. First, most are rightly proud of their efforts in East Timor. The idea of helping the Timorese is a source of true professional satisfaction and true personal satisfaction as well. Witnessing the transition of Dili from a city in flames to one beginning to rebuild in early 2000, sticks in the mind of many, as do the smiling faces of East Timorese children, the waves of their parents. But at the same time, there is discomfort. It didn't take long for the average serviceman or woman, too busy with the task at hand to be concerned with high policy or strategic calculations, to understand that the terrible acts of violence so recently committed, and to understand who was responsible. Indeed, the East Timorese often went out of their way to point out the perpetrators. At the same time, those same ADF members were often asked to work with, to conduct joint patrols, for example, their Indonesian counterparts, in the full knowledge of the role the latter had so recently played. It was then, it is now, a type of friction that few reconciled. Now, I've tended not to speak of my own experiences in East Timor. I've done so recently, however, and perhaps it's pertinent, so a few words. Firstly, as a junior officer, my recollections were of no use at all to the researching and writing of official history volume. No use at all. Yet I'll share one particular instance that I recall that maybe illustrates a type of friction, how that friction played out for me on a personal level. In this case, my infantry company was stationed at a small town of Mimo on the border with Indonesia, close to the regional hub of Maliana. On one particular day, the company was conducting a small medical clinic for some locals who'd been gradually returning to their decimated village. I was observing events as the company medic and other soldiers were administering aid to the sick and injured as best they could. Suddenly a woman's desperate and pleading voice rang out. A young mother with a baby in her arms ran towards us. Some local men tried unsuccessfully to restrain her sobbing advance. She was clearly distraught with fear or grief. I didn't initially know which. When she made it to where I was standing, she pushed her baby forth, wrapped tight, which she'd been pressing to her chest. I couldn't understand her panicked words, because they were Tetum, but it seemed clear she wanted help for a child. The baby, though, was dead. A large contusion on its forehead had made it clear to me it had been struck, we subsequently found out, by militiamen. There's nothing we could do. The feeling of powerlessness was remarkable. At a policy level, let me say this, one very interesting observation would be the degree at which the public narrative about Australia's role in the East Timor crisis has drifted from the historical truth of events. Much capital appears to be made in the 2 decades that followed 1999 based on the idea of the nobility, the morality of defending the right of the East Timorese for self-determination and defending them physically from the violence perpetrated against them by Indonesian-sponsored militia groups. The reality, however, was at once much more complex, yet distillable to a simple truth. Long-term Australian policy was to ensure that East Timor remained part of the Unitary Republic of Indonesia. This was constant even after Indonesian President Habibie's unexpected announcement of a referendum. That the final result was independence must then be understood as a significant policy reversal. This is not to suggest long-term Australian policy towards Timor was without its real politic logic. In the words of other authors, the strategic value of the relationship with Jakarta was never going to be sacrificed for the sake of the Timorese. A small, potentially mendicant state to the north was not seen to be in Australia's national interest, nor the potential fragmentation nor balkanisation of Indonesia. As the volume makes clear, Australian policy towards Timor was far more complex than many existing accounts allow, but it was always guided by this realist foreign policy logic, and one at odds with how much of the Australian public saw and sees its place in the world. These two very different views became aligned in September 1999, and policy did change at this point when it was clear there was no other option than a military intervention. Then the full policy apparatus swung in behind the requirement, but not by choice. Rather because of a series of events outside of Canberra-based bureaucratic control. As a historian, I observe that in such instances where there is such divergence between public policy and the public will, there will invariably be a reckoning. I'm not a policy maker, I don't pretend to be, But significant variances as this are dangerous phenomenon. They tend not to last. A second question I'm occasionally asked is, what is the most surprising specific discovery during the process of researching the volume? To this question, one of the most startling individual findings, in my view, was connected with Prime Minister John Howard's famous letter to President Habibie in December of 1998. Often portrayed as a significant government policy change, it was in fact nothing of the sort, despite claims to the contrary. The letter suggested Indonesia might consider granting East Timor a type of political autonomy with a built-in mechanism for some form of self-determination at some future and unspecified date. Mr. Howard never advocated independence. This was not Australia's position. The double boon would be that if such a non-specific process were begun, it might take some of the heat out of the East Timor issue. It might help take the burr out from under the saddle and smooth the relationship with Jakarta. For his part, President Habibie wanted to solve the East Timor problem seen by he and his circle of advisors as a money sink, but not seen in that light by the Indonesian armed forces. Habibie had already announced in the middle of 1998 he was ready to consider special status for the province. After a deal of hollow blustering about Australian imperialist meddling aimed at domestic audiences, at a fateful cabinet meeting in January 27, 1999, President Habibie brandished a letter Prime Minister Howard sent him suggesting that after a short period of autonomy there should be a full act of self-determination for East Timor, a vote. And the rest is history. Now, what's the remarkable fact in this? The remarkable fact is that in this process, the letter itself was drafted by such a small coterie of officials at Foreign Affairs and Trade and Prime Minister and Cabinet, communicated by Mr. Downer to Mr. Howard as a good idea. At no point did anyone think to include the Department of Defence in such discussions. To his considerable chagrin, the Acting Secretary of Defence found out about the letter's existence only after it had been sent. Imagine. Remarkable given the role Defence went on to play. Now, amidst all these difficulties that I've discussed, let me underscore one important counterpoint. That is, the deployment to East Timor was a resounding success and a story that all veterans in the wider community ought to be proud. If the Defence Force were perhaps underprepared, if the policy framework was contorted, if the strategic context was complex, that's greater testament to the skill, professionalism of those involved. It's one thing to succeed when everything's running smoothly, it's another to do so under significant pressure and despite faults in the system. As far as I'm concerned, double praise to all involved, not just those who deployed to Timor, but the thousands back in Australia who worked to support deployed troops. Their contribution tends to go unsung, but it was nonetheless critical. I mentioned this at the start, ladies and gentlemen, there's danger in placing an academic in front of a captured audience. I've talked probably for too long. The role of official historian, wrote Prime Minister Turnbull, who commissioned me in this role, is one of great national significance in ensuring the production of authoritative, comprehensive and accurate accounts of Australia's military operations. This is quite the responsibility. I feel it. I feel not only the weight of tradition, but of expectation. I wonder if Bob did. If I managed to achieve anything of substance in this regard, it is, as Isaac Newton described, by standing on the shoulders of giants. Robert O'Neill was one such giant. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.